something is wrong beneath Lake Superior. Hundreds of feet below the surface, in one of the most remote and extreme environments in the Great Lakes, scientists have been finding lake trout that look like they're starving to death. They've been given a disturbing nickname of zombie fish. And the deeper scientists look, the more of them they're finding. But here's what makes this story so interesting. Scientists don't actually know what's causing it. So today, we're going beneath the surface of Lake Superior to find out what is happening to Michigan's so-called zombie fish and whether anglers should actually be worried. When you hear the word zombie fish, you might picture something out of a horror movie. That's not what we're talking about. These are a deep water form of lake trout that has evolved to live in the cold, dark depths of Lake Superior. They're built for an environment that most fish and most humans could never tolerate. But researchers have been finding some of these fish in extremely poor condition. They're incredibly thin, they're emaciated, and they appear to be severely undernourished. That's where the nickname zombie fish comes from. Not because they're aggressive, not because they're attacking other fish, and not because there's some kind of zombie virus turning fish into monsters. They're called zombie fish because of their disturbing physical condition. And this isn't happening in some tiny isolated lake. This is Lake Superior, the largest of the Great Lakes. An enormous freshwater ecosystem stretching across thousands of square miles. And somewhere beneath that surface, something appears to be changing. Now let's put this into perspective. When most of us go fishing, we're thinking about the first few feet of water. Maybe 20 feet, maybe 50, maybe 100 feet if you're fishing deep water. But these fish are living in an entirely different world. Researchers have been studying siscowet in deep water areas ranging from roughly 600 feet down to more than 1,300 feet. Think about that. 1,300 feet. That's more than a quarter of a mile straight down. No sunlight, extremely cold water, and an environment where food can be limited. At the deepest point of Lake Superior, an area known as Superior Maximus, the bottom is roughly 1,320 feet beneath the surface. Now imagine dropping a line from the surface and continuing to let it out. 600 feet, 800 feet, 1,000 feet, and then another 300 feet. Down there, you're entering a world that very few people will ever see firsthand. And that's where scientists have been finding these fish. Here's where this story gets really interesting. Because scientists aren't just finding one or two sick-looking fish. In 2015, approximately 3% of the deepwater trout caught during surveys were classified as being in this zombie condition. By the 2024 and 2025 surveys, that number had risen to roughly 20% across the deepwater sampling areas. And at Superior Maximus, the numbers were even more striking. In 2024, approximately 37% of the trout caught there were classified as zombies. In 2025, that number reached 54%. Now, I want to stop right here because this is where things can get distorted online. That does not mean that 54% of all the fish in Lake Superior are zombie fish. It doesn't even mean that 54% of all lake trout are affected. That number comes from a specific deepwater sampling location involving siscowet captured there. That's an important distinction. Because we're trying to understand what is actually happening, not make the story scarier than it already is. But even with that clarification, those numbers are enough to make scientists take notice. And this is the part of the story where things get complicated. Because right now, there isn't a simple answer. Scientists are investigating whether a fish pathogen could be involved. In other words, could these fish actually be sick? But another possibility involves the food web in the deepest parts of Lake Superior. If these fish aren't finding enough food, they could essentially be starving. And that raises some fascinating questions. Is the availability of food changing? Is something happening to the organisms these fish depend on? Is the deep water ecosystem changing? Could environmental conditions be playing a role? Could there be more than one factor involved? Those are the questions researchers are trying to answer. And that's what makes this story so fascinating. Because right now, we don't have the ending. Scientists don't have the definitive answer. And that's okay. Sometimes the most interesting stories in the outdoors are the ones where we're still trying to figure out what we're looking at. So why should someone who fishes Michigan care about a strange-looking trout living more than 1,000 feet beneath Lake Superior? Because these fish are part of a much larger ecosystem. They are predators in the deep water food web, and their condition can tell scientists something about the environment they're living in. Think about an ecosystem like a giant chain. You've got the tiny organisms at the bottom, then the small prey, then larger fish, then predators. When something changes at one level, it can potentially affect everything above it. So when scientists find a predator that's suddenly showing signs of severe nutritional stress, they want to know why. That doesn't automatically mean Lake Superior is collapsing. It doesn't mean the fishery is doomed, and it doesn't mean anglers should stop fishing. But it does mean there's something worth watching, because healthy ecosystems don't stay healthy by accident. They require monitoring, they require research, and they require people paying attention. And this is where the story gets really interesting. Because scientists aren't just sitting in an office looking at photographs. They're going into the field. Michigan researchers and Michigan State University fish pathologists have been investigating the phenomenon and collecting fish for additional testing. Researchers have even headed towards Superior Maximus, the deepest part of Lake Superior, to collect additional specimens. They're looking for evidence. They're examining the fish. They're investigating whether a pathogen could be involved. And they're trying to determine whether the problem is related to food availability or something larger happening within the deep water ecosystem. Think about the difficulty of that research. You're not standing on the bank of a river. You're not dropping a minnow beneath a bobber. You're working in one of the deepest freshwater environments on Earth. And you're trying to understand what's happening to animals living more than 1,000 feet below you. That's an incredible scientific challenge. And honestly, I think that's one of the coolest parts of this entire story. So here's the question everybody wants answered. Should we be worried? Right now, the answer is not necessarily. The Michigan Department of Natural Resources has made it clear that this trend deserves further investigation, but it is not currently considered a reason for alarm. And that's important because it's easy to take a story like this and turn it into Lake Superior is dying, or Michigan's fish are infected, or half the fish in Lake Superior are zombies. Those headlines might get clicks, but they're not what the science is telling us. What we actually know is much more interesting. Scientists have identified an unusual condition in deepwater trout. They've documented that condition increasing over time in their surveys. They've seen particularly high numbers at Superior Maximus, and now they're trying to figure out why. That's the story. And until the research gives us more answers, that's where we should leave it. The next step is continued research. Scientists need more samples. They need more testing. They need to understand whether pathogens are involved. They need to understand what's happening to the deepwater food web, and they need to keep monitoring these fish over time. Because one of the most important things in wildlife research is establishing whether you're looking at a temporary event or the beginning of a long-term change. That's something only time and more research can tell us. And personally, I think that's what makes Lake Superior so fascinating. We spend our lives around these waters. We fish them, we explore them, we photograph them, we tell stories about them. But even now, there are enormous portions of this lake that remain almost completely out of sight. More than 1,000 feet below the surface is a world most of us will never experience. And something is happening down there that scientists are still trying to understand. Lake Superior has always been a place where we know there's more happening beneath the surface than we can see. And now scientists have discovered something unusual happening more than 1,000 feet below that surface. The zombie fish aren't monsters. They're not attacking other fish. And right now there's no evidence that they're spreading some kind of contagious disease throughout the Great Lakes. There's something much more interesting. They're a mystery that may tell us something important about one of the world's greatest freshwater ecosystems. And somewhere down there, in the darkness of Lake Superior, scientists are still looking for the answer. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. If you're interested in booking a guided Upper Peninsula fishing adventure, contact me for availability. And as always, stay wild.